Organized a program full of rock stars, but we like to think of our next presenters as the power trio of public interest communications. Anne Cristiano, Annie Niemann, and Matt Sheehan. They're going to share with us essential principles in the science of story building. And we're ready for from the Frank program at the University of Florida, Anne, Annie, and Matt.
Thank you, Vince. And we're very happy to be here. My name's Matt Sheehan. I'm very glad to be joined by my two colleagues, Anne Cristiano, the Frank Perel Chair in Public Interest Communications at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications, which is a mouthful, and Annie Niemann, who is the Research Director for our newly formed Center for Public Interest Communications at the aforementioned UF College of Journalism and Communications. We like acronyms, so it's the UFCJC, which is the last time you'll probably hear that today. But we're very happy to be here and in Philly and joining you in a little bit cooler weather than what we're accustomed to in Florida. So we're happy to be here and talking about what we're terming the science of story building. And because the academic year has just concluded, and you can take us out of the classroom, but we're still college professors, so we're going to start with a little assignment for you. We'd like you to take a moment and jot down on paper, technically, tweet it to yourself, what have you, and think about a story that you tell as part of your job. We're going to come back to that story as we go through our principles that science tells us about story building.
This is the story of a My mind flashes, I see the ashes of the masters who touch the masses. I ask if I'll ever be one. When I die, will heaven be done? What will my legend become? I will forever be young through old tales. A breakdancer down at Odell's. Streets named after me is where my soul dwells. Desires of a church choir, Trinity united. I think of good memories that Hennessy provided. Memories divided by perception. Will it be water for chocolate or resurrection? The path to perfection is rarely achieved. I head in a direction I dream and believe. An underground dude that overachieved. From the windy city I was blowing their weaves. Somewhere along the way I aired out them seas. But to stand out some days you may freeze. Degrees.
Who lives and who dies? Who...
Thank you. So we're seeing a little bit of I's, and you've all successfully completed your first assignment, so you all get A's. And thank you, Anne and Annie, for resisting the urge to mom dance on this wonderful stage to the soundtrack of Hamilton. It has been said that before history, there was stories. And that is true if you think about it. If we go back to the cave paintings in France, humans have been telling stories throughout our existence. According to Yuval Harari, many of you may have read his book Sapiens or his follow-ups Homo Deus and his upcoming one all about artificial intelligence, the ability to tell stories is what makes us uniquely human and unique among all the other animals on Earth. You think about it. We often conflate story with fact. When telling stories, we're trying to convey facts. But there are so many other creatures that are able to convey facts. Humans are the only ones to convey stories. So think about, we'll take this to fitting our surroundings here in the city of Philadelphia and its history. Think about this. For many of us, we carried this portrait around for years. And perhaps we knew of one of the founding fathers and the creator of our Federal Reserve System and much of what we consider banking today. But it wasn't until a compelling story came around that we knew who Alexander Hamilton was. So the difference between facts and stories is apparent. And for the record, totally Peggy. of the three Schuyler sisters. So, as curious minds, what did we do? We wanted to know, we know a great deal about great storytelling at the College of Journalism and Communications. You all know a great deal about great storytelling through your work and the work of others. What we don't know necessarily beyond anecdote and what has worked for us and what has worked for people that we admire, what is the science behind what makes effective stories? So we wanted to look into that. And we did what we often do, is bring a ton of really smart people together and talk about it. So we created a Science of Storytelling Summit with support from the Knight Foundation and the indulgence of our great dean, Diane McFarland, who didn't fire us when we brought her the idea. We brought together nearly a dozen scholars from a range of disciplines to really look at what makes stories effective, how stories resonate. We called that the science of story building, and we're here today to talk to you about the 7 principles that we found through that work. The first, and we'll get back to this, that won't be the only time, you don't have to scurry to write it down. We'll send the PowerPoints through our learning management system like all the students love these days, right? No, just kidding. The first principle we really want to spend some time on today is structure. And how stories are structured plays into how stories resonate. We have structures that we've seen through our work in journalism, which is my area of expertise. We have the inverted pyramid. We have story structures through tweets, through Vines, although that's dead now, Instagram stories, etc. What research and scholarship tells us, however, is the most effective format or structure for a story to break through to non-expert audiences. It isn't an exposition of data. It isn't a scholarly article. It is a story formulated through the narrative structure. So in our terms, we equate narrative with story. So anytime you hear us say story, we're talking about a narrative. You all are probably very familiar with Freytag's arc here. We see this a lot in fiction, that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have characters. Those characters go through something. They reach, something happens to them, and then they resolve that. That is the narrative paradigm for story, and that is the structure that we often find scholarship tells us is the most effective. We see other developments around this. Kurt Vonnegut, some of you may know him and be a fan of his work. He was studying anthropology, and he tried to create a scholar article around what they call the shape of stories. Well, his anthropology professors thought that was too simple for an academic paper, but here we are, a bunch of academics referencing it. We see that reinforced through additional work like that of Christopher Booker and others, the 7 basic plots. We see these schemas come through and structured in such a way that narratives, if you think about it, all stories tend to fall, many stories tend to fall within one of these 7 plots. Those plots are Overcoming the Monster, stories of rags to riches, or its inverse, riches to rags. You have stories of a quest. You have stories of voyage and return, where a character enters a world that is unlike their own and comes back transformed. You have stories of comedy, not so much ha-ha comedy, but think Greek comedy, where characters experience events that have an ultimately happy outcome. And of course, it's inverse tragedy, where characters experience events and have an unhappy outcome. And you have stories of rebirth. So as you're structuring your stories, think about, do your stories fit that narrative structure? Are you telling vignettes? Are you reinforcing messaging points and calling those stories? Can you enforce that narrative structure? And think about how you can utilize the 7 basic plots and other constructs for it. Can you create a different way of telling that story, appealing to a different audience, or making that story more fresh by telling your story through another one of the universal plots?
Thanks, Matt. So one of the things that we often look to stories to do is to help people access their emotions. And if you're like me, I worked for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for many years, and we would say, we need to tell a story. We need to tell a story that really gets to people's heartstrings. I never want to hear that phrase again. Because so many times when we go to storytelling and we think about telling an emotional story, we kind of go here. Do you love this? You love Anna. You're Anna. Should I keep going? You want to... Should I make stop? You want? Oh, stop! Stop! Oh, sorry. I thought you guys seemed like animal. Are you not animal lovers? You don't like animals? Yeah. I have 4 cats, a dog, and a goldfish named Eliza. I love animals, but every time this thing comes on, I go make a sandwich, and you probably do too, right? And the reason for that is I probably don't need to cite any studies to remind you that people don't like to feel bad. And so as we start to think about emotions, we need to think about the full range of emotions that are available to us. With so many to work from, scientists recently identified 27 distinct emotions. Why do we so frequently go to sadness or fear? It's certainly true that if you look at emotion from the perspective of adaptive psychology, you might see something like sadness and say, this makes me want to reach out, this makes me want to connect. But if, like that video I just showed you, I don't have a way to resolve my sadness, I'm going to just check out. So research shows us that positive emotions like awe, also described as the overview effect, connect us to others. They open us to new perspectives. They make us feel small in the world, and they inspire us to learn. So activating awe, if you were trying to access somebody's mind and change their perspective on something, you might go to awe. Or you might find that pride is a more effective emotion to access than empathy. We do some work with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, and one of the things that we hear often from them is, we just want people to empathize with the refugee experience. It's not that we don't care about refugees, though. It's that that's really hard and painful, and I don't want to. And the great news is that you don't necessarily have to get your audience to empathize to be able to make a difference, and that pride might be far more motivating, getting people to feel pride that they had helped to alleviate suffering. It's also true that when we feel a profound emotion, yeah, see what we did there? When we feel a profound emotion, we also remember everything that happens immediately afterward. Because you introduced us so beautifully this morning to a sense of awe, you are all much more likely to remember what the 3 of us are saying. So thank you. It's also true that virality is associated with these really strong emotions. We've got research here on this, and we also saw a study just recently published in Science that showed that viral content is associated most strongly with surprise and disgust. So as you think about the emotions that you're invoking in your stories, I urge you to think, what is it that you want people to do as a result of having heard that story? And what would they feel if they were doing that?
So think about the issues that you're working on, and think about the people that you serve. And undoubtedly, there is probably a stereotypical story told about those people or that issue, right? That is what researchers call a master narrative. That's the dominant way that we as a society tend to think about a particular issue or a group of people. The problem is that these narratives often create biases and assumptions and stereotypes in our minds, right? And so it's our task to produce counter-narratives that break away from stereotypes, that break away from expectations, and replace those narratives with new ones. Those are called counter-narratives. We see this happening with the refugee crises. If you look at research focused on the news media, the master narrative is that refugees are posing a threat to our society, or they're creating a burden. And so what we see is that the humanitarian sector is working to create a counter-narrative to that master narrative, where they're trying to help us see that refugees are just like you and me, but they've lost everything and they just need our help. But what we're also seeing is that that's creating a new master narrative, where refugees are sort of seen as hopeless beneficiaries of these organizations and lack agency. So it's critical for us as change makers to be very conscious of the narratives that we put out. Yes, we need to put out counter narratives to rewrite assumptions, but we have to be careful that we don't create new ones. And throughout history, we have seen that counter narratives can change the world. For example, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she provided a counter-narrative to society about slavery. And because of that, she ignited the abolitionist movement, right? And Lincoln said, "So this is the little woman who started the war." We also see that just this past week. Did you guys get to catch this incredible music video? I think I've watched it 20 times. I'm obsessed with it. But what we saw was that Donald Glover gathered multiple master narratives about what it's like to be a Black person in America. And because he brought them together, he challenged us to reflect on our society and think differently about their experiences. As change makers, we need to think about narratives with intention. Sometimes we can play into master narratives in order to capture the attention of the communities we're trying to engage with, and sometimes we need to strategically put out counter narratives in order to capture their attention. In the US, as we advocated for marriage equality, we played into a master narrative that everyone should have the right to marry the one they love. That was coming out of the LGBT movement. But in Ireland, that master narrative didn't work as they tried to pass the marriage referendum. What they needed to do was motivate older male voters to vote in favor of the marriage referendum. And what they found was that they were motivated by familiar love for their child, love for their parent. And so they put out a new narrative that focused on love between family members and equal rights under the law. And that was a counter narrative to a master narrative put out by a social movement organization. So as you think about the work that you're doing, what are the dominant stories told about that work? And how can you put out counter narratives to overwrite some of those master narratives by using different plot structures and different emotions?
All right. Our fourth rule is to surprise your audience. Can we be honest about something for a second? I know you guys are really into stories. I know that people like Andy Goodman have really led the field in helping us to tell better stories about our work. But the challenge is a lot of the stories that we're telling kind of suck. I'm sorry.
Safe space.
It's a safe space. So what do we do to make stories not suck? We have to surprise our audience. Matt mentioned the summit that we did where we brought together scholars from all over the world to help us learn how to tell better stories. And my most favorite participant was a guy named Keith Bound from the University of Nottingham. And his area of research in media psychology focuses on how to make horror films scarier. Cool guy. Really fun guy to have a conversation with, but not after dinner. So one of the things that Keith told us is that in horror films, we have to work at the edge of people's expectations. We have to keep them just comfortable enough that they're willing to stay with us, but then also surprise them. Interestingly, comedy works the same way, and it's called the benign violation theory. So
let's see what's really going on here.
Give me a minute. Not quite ready. Hold up, Benjamin. So I kind of struggled with how to explain this idea, and then I thought about my most favorite TED Talk of all time, Benjamin Zander's talk about the power of classical music. Have you seen it? No. You should watch it sometime when you're eating lunch at your desk and wondering what to do instead of answering email with one hand while you hold your sandwich. In this talk, Benjamin Zander says everything that we need to learn about how to use surprise in stories and why it's so important.
So let's see what's really going on here. We have a B. This is a B. The next note is a C. And the job of the C is to make the B sad. And it does, doesn't it? Composers know that. If they want sad music, they just play those two notes. But basically, it's just a B with four sads. Now it goes down to A. And now to G. And then to F. So we have B, A, G, F. And if we have B, A, G, F, what do we expect next? Oh, that might have been a fluke. Let's try it again. Ooh, the TED choir. And you notice nobody is tone deaf. Is that right? Nobody's, every village in Bangladesh and every hamlet in China, everybody knows. Da, 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 da. Everybody knows who's expecting that E. Now, Chopin didn't want to reach the E there because what will have happened? It'll be over, like Hamlet. You remember Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3? He finds out that his uncle killed his father. You remember he keeps on going up to his uncle and almost killing him. And then he backs away, and then he goes up to him again and almost kills him. And the critics, all of whom sitting in the back row there, they have to have an opinion. So they say, Hamlet is a procrastinator. Or they say, Hamlet has an Oedipus complex. No, otherwise the play would be over, stupid. That's why Shakespeare puts all that stuff in Hamlet, Ophelia going mad and the play within the play and Yorick's skull and the gravediggers. That's in order to delay until Act 5 he can kill him. It's the same with the Chopin. He's just about to reach the E and he says, oops, better go back up and do it again. So he does it again. Now he gets excited. That's excitement, you don't have to worry about it. Now he gets to F sharp and finally he goes down to E. But it's the wrong chord. Because the chord he's looking for is this one. Right. And instead he does. Now we call that a deceptive cadence. Because it deceives us. I always tell my students, if you have a deceptive cadence, be sure to raise your eyebrows, then everybody will know. All right. So he gets to E, but it's the wrong chord. Now he tries E again. That chord doesn't work. Now he tries E again. That chord doesn't work. Now he tries E again. That doesn't work. And then finally, there was a gentleman in the front row who went, like that.
The eyebrow wiggle is obviously optional. But as you think about the stories that you tell, in all of the work that we do, we encourage you, of course, to tell true stories. But in the stories that you tell, we urge you to look for these moments that surprise and delight your audience. This is what our brains are craving. In fact, our brains look for deceptive cadences, and we pay attention to broken patterns because to our lizard brain, a broken pattern means one of two things. It means food or threat, right? We have to pay attention to both of those things. So as you look for stories, as you spot stories, look for stories that create these moments of surprise and delight. So how does your story break your audience's expectations? How are you presenting something in a way that doesn't go as expected?
So as we were discussing this session with the Media Impact Funders team, we decided that rather than throw all 7 principles at you in one long session and be overwhelmed, we're going to split this into 2. So we'll be back this afternoon to finish up the last 3 principles that science tells us about stories. But I think it's important to reinforce that we don't see this as a checklist. This isn't a rubric for you to fill out, and once you hit every single one of these things with your story, you're all of a sudden going to be viral and successful. We consider storytelling an art, and like great art, there are techniques that we can learn from. Consider these the techniques. And I think it's really important, Anne mentioned this earlier, to reinforce that why we are giving you tactics and techniques to massage or manipulate your stories. We come from a tradition and a perspective that all stories for organizations like ours should be rooted in the truth. So we ask that you think of these as factual stories and for verifiable things as you do this. But you can see how we can use these frameworks that we are hardwired to us as humans to really amplify and reinforce the stories that you have. So we'll be back at 3:45 this afternoon with the final 3 science of storytelling principles, and then we'll do a little bit of a workshop for you. So keep your story, keep your homework. Nobody turned it in. Avoid any dogs this afternoon. And we'll be back.
Then we have time for some questions.
Awesome.
Oh, terrific.
Do people have some questions?
Stunned silence. We always love that.
There's always that moment.
Hi there. I actually walked in the middle of your talk, so forgive me if you cover this. But I walked in during the master counter-narratives part. And it seems like context is really important when you're either creating or choosing those narratives. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the best methods you've seen for identifying narratives that are out there, and then also testing narratives for a particular strategic communication.
I would say when we try to think through this question together, we agree that context is everything, and we seem to come to the shared conclusion that the best way to identify a counter-narrative is to seek out the voices of those most affected by the issue and amplify their stories. People don't live master narrative lives, and so if you tell their story in its true form and it's authentic, and you include their complexities and their nuances, you're inevitably going to break away from a master narrative. What system you would use to identify those would probably have to be specific to the organization that you're part of, whatever resources you have or your protocol, but really focusing on the people who are served or affected by the work that you do and really working to help them tell their own stories is a great place to start.
I think there are a couple of frameworks that we use to help identify that. We're big fans of stealing the best ideas from human-centered design and design thinking, and really looking at a community-focused storytelling platform. Ann and Annie, in the last year, had a story in the Stanford Social Innovation Review that there's a 4-question framework that really helps in identifying who you're trying to communicate with and how to help them. And if you start with those 4 questions, finding those master narratives becomes much easier because you can target specifically on the communities that you're trying to reach.
Oh, sorry. That's me.
Hello there, Amanda Stanley from Compass. You had mentioned the 7 common story arcs that are universal. Are they universal, or are there different story arcs that you find in different cultures? So what is the relevance to cultural context, and are those 7 story arcs, focused on Western culture?
For sure. They definitely come from the Western perspectives. I'm getting double-mic'd here. Western perspectives, with our work with the UN, we're finding other kind of those story arcs. So again, we go back to knowing who your communities that you're trying to reach and figuring that out. Some of these stories are universal. They may not necessarily have the same connotations as to the Western culture, but you always find stories of rebirth throughout all cultures and stuff like that. And Booker's, while it is a construct and a frame, is not unique to it. You've got Vonnegut's shapes of stories. There's a mathematician that we found that has done algorithms that have developed these types of stories and called them something different. Oedipus is a big one, and that sort of stuff. So we all love our mothers.
Hi, I'm Fernando Multedo, and I represent the Multedo Fund, and I'm from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. My background is in math and sciences education. The sciences of telling a story sounds like a play in words of telling just science, because science is tied to 5 principles, which are introduction, literature analysis, methodology, data analysis, and conclusion. You cannot put the conclusion in front of the introduction or the literature analysis after the data collection. How do you, think on how putting your feelings, in these 5 steps that are mandatory in the science project?
Sure.
I think that I've reflected a lot on the fact that the scientific method and the story arc are not dissimilar, right? And both of them represent the story plot structure of quest or voyage and discovery. Both of them lend themselves really beautifully to storytelling. I think it's also interesting that some recent research from some linguists has shown that much of the language that we use in science to convey the fact that science will always be associated with uncertainty is also associated with great storytelling. Words like seem and appear build tension and curiosity, and those are exactly the same kinds of words that a scientist uses to ethically represent her findings.
I would also add 2 points. There was a study that was recently done within a year or so that looked at academic papers that follow a narrative, take a narrative form, and they were more likely to be cited. So that's a win for taking a narrative approach. And then in terms of how do you build emotion into an academic paper, I had the privilege of talking to Karen Val-Jorgensen, who is at Cardiff University. She's a media scholar. And she looked at Pulitzer Prize-winning stories over a 20-year period. And what she found was that journalists often outsourced the emotion to the characters in the story through their voice as a way to maintain objectivity as a journalist. So the journalist could remain objective and credible, but tell a very emotionally compelling story by giving voice to the people. So if you are doing research where you can include qualitative data mixed with statistical data and use the qualitative piece to build in compelling emotions, that might be one way to do that.
I think that's probably a good place for us to stop for now, and they will be back with us this afternoon, as they mentioned, and they'll be with us all day, too, so you can always grab any one of them in the breaks or at lunch to dig deeper into your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.